following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools, funded in part by the Virginia Satellite Educational Network.
Welcome to Meet the Author. I'm your host, Della Kidd. Joining me here at the MTA studio is Cokie Roberts. You might recognize her from ABC News, where she's a political commentator. Or perhaps you've heard her on National Public Radio, where she's a senior news analyst. But Cokie is also a newspaper journalist and an author. Today we'll be talking about her historical books, Founding Mothers, The Women Who Raised Our Nation, and Ladies of Liberty, The Women Who Shaped Our Nation. Also with us are students from Annandale High School's International Baccalaureate History class in Annandale, Virginia. It's great having all of you here today with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Cokie, I know our students have many questions that they're going to be asking you while we're here together.
I'm eager to hear them.
There's some good ones too. I've already heard them. But before we get started, can you give our viewers a brief overview of Founding Mothers and Ladies of Liberty?
Yes, these are books about the women at the founding period of our country. Essentially the women who influenced the founding fathers. Some of them are their wives and mothers and sisters and friends, daughters. Others are women who were writers and who were influential in the period as writers or as educators. Some are women who were settlers and moved west and were part of the founding experience. And so they are women in different walks of life, but they're mainly the political women. The women in Founding Mothers, they are the women who got through the Revolution and then started with the founding of the country in first New York and then Philadelphia. That book ends with the inauguration of John Adams, because at that point we had a contested election. The loser accepted the consequences, and you know that's still an enormous thing around the world. We're so used to it here, but it's a big deal for the loser to accept the consequences. And so we knew that the experiment would continue. So I ended the first book there, and then the second book goes, The Ladies of Liberty, goes from John Adams to John Quincy Adams, because of course that was the beginning of the next generation, literally. So that's fun for me particularly, because that was also early Washington, and seeing this city where I live and have lived most of my life grow up as a little miserable little town into something slightly less miserable by the end of the era.
Fascinating history of all of these folks, told stories, and they all just so interesting to learn about in their own right. So many I had never heard about, and so many we had preconceived notions about.
Right.
Exactly. Well, today's guest is Cokie Roberts. If you would like to join our discussion, we welcome your questions. Our number is 1-800-231-6359. If you're calling us locally, you may reach us at 703-978-1636. Ladies, I know you've all read the books, and I know you have many of questions to pose to Cokie, so let's get started. Selma, we'll begin with you.
Mrs. Roberts, what inspired you to write about these women, the founding mothers, and what inspired you to write in general?
Well, in general, I write. I've always written, and I love to write, at least in theory. In practice, it's really hard. But in terms of writing about these women, I have covered women in politics, both as office holders and as voters. I grew up with parents in politics, and I saw the role of political wives and how influential they were in my era, in the late 40s, throughout the 1950s. And I figured that in this incredibly important period of our history, that the women had to be at least as influential as they were in my childhood, and I knew nothing about them. Martha Washington at Valley Forge, Dolly Madison saving the portrait of George Washington, I mean, it was about it. Abigail Adams, Remember the Ladies. But So I figured that if I didn't know anything about them, a lot of people didn't know anything about them. And so I decided I really had to sit down and find out about them. And then it turned out that the reason I didn't know anything about them was because nobody had really done the work. And it was very hard work to do because it was detective work to find women's papers and to find what they had written. And of course, we are dependent on what they wrote. But it was well worth it because they're terrific women.
Ms. Roberts, what other resources did you consult when conducting your research for these books?
Well, their writings are, of course, key. And we are very lucky that Abigail Adams, poor Abigail, was alone for long periods of her life. But that meant she had to write a lot of letters. And so we have literally thousands of letters of hers. And many of them have been published into books. And also now the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is the custodian of these wonderful documents, has gotten so organized that they actually have her letters to John Adams and his letters to her online, which is fabulous. For others, I really looked for women whose writings we did have. And so some of the women that I chose, I chose them because we did have their writings. But of course there were women I couldn't ignore. I couldn't ignore, nor did I want to, someone like Martha Washington, who destroyed her correspondence with George Washington, at least we believe she did. So you had to sort of piece together information about her from the few letters we do have, but also from what other people said about her contemporaneously. So that meant finding biographies of other people where she was mentioned, or Mount Vernon, for instance, has a wonderful research department, and people there were very helpful. It really is going through university libraries and freestanding libraries like the Library of Congress or the Huntington Library in Pasadena, or the historical societies or historic homes. Those are the places where you can find these things. But even when they realize that they've had them, which sometimes they don't even know they have women's papers, they are often not well kept. They are hardly ever transcribed. So you're dealing with 18th century handwriting, so it's fascinating, but it's very difficult.
Before Annetta poses a question, I have a question. During Martha Washington's time, was it a common practice for people to destroy their personal correspondence?
Apparently. There were two reasons for it. One was that it was personal, and I think she was well aware of that, but also for the women, many of them were not formally educated, and some of them were embarrassed about their spelling and their punctuation and all of that. So they didn't want to be embarrassed. But she destroyed her correspondence. But then Thomas Jefferson destroyed his correspondence with his wife. Again, probably because it was personal, and his correspondence with the men. He knew. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind about the founders is that they were very self-aware. They knew they were doing something extraordinary. And that if they won, if they succeeded, that they would go down in history and that they would be published. And so they wrote with that in mind. And so their letters are very careful and somewhat contrived and somewhat pompous in many cases, whereas their letters to the women are much more freewheeling and funny and filled with their predicaments and with their ambitions and with their fears, which is why I like it so much, right, because they become much more three-dimensional people.
Gave us a real glimpse of day-to-day life.
That's right.
Yeah.
So.
Annetta, what was your question?
Among the more elite women and ladies of liberty, Abigail Adams assumed many responsibilities that would have typically fallen to her husband had he not been away for such long periods of time. What gave her the ability to move out of her role and place in society, and do you believe she was an exceptional woman?
She was an exceptional woman. But there were lots of exceptional women, as there were lots of exceptional men at the time. You know, the times can shape the person. And And that was certainly true at the time of the Revolution. Abigail, in particular, was raised to be a somewhat exceptional woman. Her father was a preacher, and she and her sisters were educated in his parlor, but they were highly educated women. And I mean, they couldn't go to college, but they were educated along with the boys all the way to that point. And they, you know, they knew French and they knew the classics and all of that. And her sisters also had very strong political views. I mean, we have their letters, and so it wasn't just she. But the fact is that she was called upon to be exceptional, and I think that is the thing. That was one of the first things that surprised me when I started doing the work, was how directly these women who were supposed to be, you know, tending the farm and the children and all of that, did have a sphere, as you put it. They were directly called upon to resist the British. And the Daughters of Liberty, the flyers up on the trees, the broadsheets, all of that called on the women to resist. And of course, the main weapon of resistance was the boycott. And they were the shoppers. They were the people that would have to be exercising the weapon, and they did.
Cokie, let's talk a little bit about Martha Washington, our First Lady.
Right.
Why is her story still so relevant to those who are married to the President of the United States?
Well, because it's still a balancing act. And, you know, I was thinking about this the other day, that in some ways Michelle Obama is having to do the same kind of balancing that Martha Washington did. Because, of course, when she came in, here we were, this tiny little country, you know, just sort of huddled on the eastern seaboard, and Europe thought we were ridiculous, you know, and so she had to set a tone of a household that was suitable for a head of state, she had to entertain in a fashion that would be considered worthy by the crowns of Europe, but also considered appropriate by the people who had just fought off monarchy and wanted to establish a republic. And so it was quite a balancing act, and she was very well aware that she was having to walk that tightrope. And she said in letters, you know, they call me the First Lady of the land, but I feel more like the chief state prisoner. And I think a lot of First Ladies have felt that way since. And I was thinking about it in terms of Michelle Obama, because they've come in on a similar sort of wave, you know, where the voters kind of had a huge grassroots operation, and a sense on the part of particularly young people and newly enfranchised people that they owned this first couple, you know, and so she has to be down home enough to satisfy that grassroots impulse, but still sophisticated and formal and regal enough to be appropriate as the wife of a head of state. And it's always a tough balancing act.
Certainly a trailblazer.
Yes.
Ever since Martha Washington, First Ladies have carved time to explore and advocate for issues important to them and the country. Lady Bird Johnson was probably the first green First Lady, as she promoted the planting of wildflowers along our nation's highways. Nancy Reagan tried to reduce drug use among the young. Let's take a brief look at other accomplished ladies with a mission. Don't go away.
From Martha Washington to Michelle Obama, the women serving as First Lady of the United States become a public figure almost overnight. Some have embraced the spotlight, while others have been more comfortable behind the scenes. Nevertheless, each First Lady has defined and shaped her role in her own unique way. A formidable First Lady in the 20th century was Eleanor Roosevelt. She conducted business very differently from the other First Ladies. Eleanor devoted her time to improving basic human rights. She lectured, traveled, and often spoke on her husband's behalf during his presidency. As First Lady, she wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day. As a 21st century First Lady, former librarian Laura Bush chose to focus on literacy during her husband's presidency. She sponsored book festivals attended by thousands in her home state of Texas and then in Washington, D.C. She even co-wrote a children's book with her daughter Jenna called Read All About It. Current First Lady Michelle Obama has a law degree, professional career experience, and young children. She understands the challenges that today's working mothers often face. One such challenge? Getting kids to make healthy food choices. She recently unveiled the Let's Move campaign to raise awareness of childhood obesity in this country. Who knows, one day there might be a first gentleman, and he'll support the troops, raise social awareness, and highlight important issues of the day, just like all the first ladies before him.
It's apparent that the First Ladies and possible First Gentlemen can be advocates for very, very important issues. We have more questions. Kelly, what is your question for Cokie?
As you already discussed Martha Washington and Abigail Adams, in all your books, you discussed many other women too. So after doing all of your research, if you had to pick one of these women to, as the most influential, who would you pick?
You know, I always have trouble with questions like that. I have trouble with them today when people say to me, who's your favorite politician, or, you know, your worst, although that's easier. But they were influential in different ways. So that, for instance, obviously Martha Washington was very influential in terms of her establishing the role of First Lady. But before that, I can make a very good case that she was incredibly useful and essential to the cohesion of the Continental Army. There were times when soldiers were threatening desertion by regiment because they were unfed, unhoused, unclothed, unpaid, and she and the other officers' wives would go in. You know, I said I knew about the winter of Valley Forge, but she was there every winter at camp for the 8 long years of the Revolutionary War, and she and the other officers' wives would sew for the soldiers and cook for the soldiers and nurse the soldiers and pray with the soldiers and put on entertainments for them to keep up troop morale, to keep troops from deserting, and they loved her. So that was certainly very influential. And then we were talking about taking up causes. She lobbied for the veterans after the war because she knew that she had been to camp with them. Abigail Adams was obviously more of a political philosopher, and she was influential in that way, and very much influenced her husband's thinking, sometimes to his advantage, sometimes to his disadvantage. Her tremendous support for the Alien and Sedition Acts, for instance, was very detrimental to him. Dolly Madison was probably, in some ways, the most directly politically influential. She really essentially ran her husband's campaigns. You know, the campaigns weren't then what they are now, but to the extent that they existed in the parlors of Washington, and she was the foremost party giver, and she knew exactly what she was doing. When he was elected the first time, when Madison was elected the first time in 1808, his opponent was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who said, "I was defeated by Mr. and Mrs. Madison. I would have had a better chance if I had been running against Mr. Madison alone." And then in 1812, when Madison was wildly unpopular, and she really ran his campaign at that point, and he won in the Electoral College. He didn't do as well in the popular vote, but the Electoral College, of course, was the men that she wined and dined. And later in the century, James G. Blaine wrote, Mrs. Madison saved the administration of her husband. But for her, DeWitt Clinton would have been elected president in 1812. So you can't get more influential than that. And the fact that it was recognized in the era, I find fascinating.
Because though it was unpaid, she did consider it a full-time job.
Oh, absolutely. And Louisa Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife, when he was running for president, again, pretending not to, she referred to the campaign as my campaign, and the goal of getting him elected, my vocation. So there was no hide the ball about it.
No, not at all. Emma, what is your question for Cokie?
In Ladies of Liberty, I was especially fascinated by the role that the Ursuline nuns played in educating females. I was wondering how critical you thought these types of unsung heroes were in the development of our democracy and success of our nation overall.
Absolutely critical. My essential thesis in Ladies of Liberty, which I did not expect to be the case until I got to know these women, is that as the country moved west and it became more exuberant and exciting, and it was a place then as now that people came to make it, you know, there were people being left behind, and it was the women who took up their causes, you know, in social service organizations or in schools or whatever. And it was very difficult for these women to do because, of course, they had no political rights and no legal rights, but they did it. And the Ursulines arrived in New Orleans, my hometown, in 1727. They were sent by the French government to educate the French soldiers and their children, and to nurse them, to set up hospitals for them. And they immediately saw the need in the city and started teaching girls, and started teaching, in addition to the children of the French settlers, they started free schools for free blacks and for Indians, which is just, think about it, this is 1727. And they were constantly at odds with both the civil authorities and the church authorities, because they were on the ground seeing what was needed and doing it. And they were really at the beginning of a long line of women religious in this country who have done incredible work. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who has since been canonized, is also one of the women in Ladies of Liberty, and her story as setting up the parochial school system in America is an incredible story.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, do you have a question for Cokie Roberts? Come on, join the discussion. Our phone lines are open. Our number nationally is 1-800-231-6359. If you're calling us locally, you may reach us at 703-978-1636. Michelle, did you have a follow-up question?
I know that what we find a lot today is that what we think about historical figures is not always exactly the case of how it literally happened in history. And so I was wondering, in doing your research, which woman specifically would you say that we have the greatest misconception about today?
Maybe Martha Washington. I think we think of her as just sort of this dowdy old lady, and part of that is because the most sort of familiar pictures of her, portraits of her, are in her old age. And she's wearing that stupid cap. And, you know, I think that you just think of her as sort of the little old homebody, you know, without any sense of her, of what she was doing throughout the war and then as First Lady, and of her political judgments, of which we know from other people, you know, but they quote her. And she had quite an acerbic tongue when it came to politicians of her husband's, the party that opposed her husband. So I think that we don't give her due. But I think we hardly give any of them their due. The only one that comes even close is Abigail Adams. And even with Abigail Adams, I think that, for instance, in that wonderful HBO series on the Adams, I think that she was downplayed and that she was sort of niceyed up a little bit. And she wasn't that nice. She was interesting, but she wasn't all that nice.
Annetta, what is your next question for Cokie?
As a young student, learning about leaders such as Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, they always seem to be very holistic and esteemed leaders. But as I've continued to read and learn more about them,
they could be jerks, yeah.
Yeah, their sterling reputation seemed to be a bit tarnished. How did you feel when you learn about this other side of them?
I think it makes them much more human and therefore much more admirable. What I have no desire to tear down these guys, quite the contrary. They did remarkable things, and the country was well served by having them where they were. But they were guys. They were not bronze and marble statues. They were people. And that makes it much harder to achieve what they achieved. And of course, that's why the women's letters are so much fun, because you can be sure their wives did not see them as bronze and marble deities, you know. And
I think we call that getting real.
That's right. And the ability to get to know them as flesh and blood human beings, I think, makes them, of course, more interesting and more real. But in the end, I think it does make them more admirable. I wish that Benjamin Franklin had been nicer to his wife and daughter, and that Thomas Jefferson liked women better than he did. But you know, these things come with being human.
I'm going to stop there. I believe we have a phone call, if that's correct. Tell us your name and what is your question today for Cokie? Hello?
Roman.
Yes, what is your name and what is your question for Cokie?
I'm Roman, and my question is, are you planning to write a chapter book of First Ladies for elementary students?
I am planning to write a book. I'm not sure it's going to be a chapter book. I think it's more sort of picture book, but with a lot more tech. I mean, it's more for elementary school, not for little kids. So I am writing that book, and I'm glad you asked. It's due at the end of this year, so with any luck, I'll have it done. I've never missed a deadline, so I think it'll get done.
That's wonderful. Thanks for calling, Roman.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling. Kelly, what is your question?
Ms. Roberts, I was wondering, to what extent do you think the history of our country would have been different if it had not been for the social networks that were established and maintained by these founding mothers?
I think it would be quite different, and I think maybe even our government today would be different, because what we did here in this country in the private sector, and it was these women who really got it going, in a lot of other places on earth is done by the government. And in fact, when Alexis de Tocqueville came through, one of the things he said was, these people have a sort of frenzy to associate. And these associations do what the crown or the bureaucracy would be doing in Europe. And I think that's right. I mean, the fact that they set up the orphanages and the fuel societies and the schools and the Sunday schools, and what happened was that as they became involved in social services and education, and started to see poverty and try to alleviate it, they also saw the particular plight of free blacks, which then led them to the plight of slaves, so that they started to become abolitionists very early in our history. And then, as abolitionists, they would go to meetings of abolition societies where they would be shut out, so where they would not be allowed to speak or not be allowed to vote because they were women. And so abolition led them directly to suffrage. So that the great, huge social movements that shaped our nation really started right away at the beginning and started among the women. And of course, those movements and their successor movements, civil rights and women's rights, really are the great movements that have come about in order to perfect our union. And I would argue that these women were absolutely at the forefront of those major social ideas.
Well, you know, we're out of time. This went by so quickly. Thank you all so much for joining us. Ladies, you had wonderful questions.
You did
Cokie,
indeed. Thank you
it was a pleasure.
very much. Nice to be with you.
I wish we had more time. It
Me
was
too.
wonderful talking to
Well,
you.
it was
Thank
great
you
to be
so
with
much.
you. Thank you.
Our guest today has been political commentator and author Cokie Roberts. If you would like to learn more about her books, Founding Mothers, The Women Who Raised Our Nation, and Ladies of Liberty, The Women Who Shaped Our Nation, please visit www.harpercollins.com. To learn more about our upcoming programs, visit us at www.fcps.edu/Fairfax Network. For the Fairfax Network, I'm Della Kidd. Keep reading, keep writing, and keep dreaming.